This presentation is brought to you by the MFOA.
Hello, my name is Craig Binning. I'm a partner at Hemson Consulting, and I'm pleased to be presenting to you about the new community benefits charge that's going to be available under the Planning Act. So I'm just going to take about 10 minutes to introduce you to the notion of community benefits charges and what they can fund and how one might go about implementing a CBC bylaw under the new provisions. So just briefly, what does the future look like? Some of the legislative changes that were originally proposed to the Development Charges Act and to the Planning Act were going to create a very complex environment for municipalities for the funding of development-related infrastructure. Fortunately, the final changes to the legislation moved it more back to what we were dealing with previously. The Development Charges Act will continue to be the prime tool used by most municipalities to fund development-related infrastructure. And the municipalities that used to use the previous Section 37 provisions of the Planning Act for density bonusing, those provisions are going to be replaced with this new community benefits charge. So municipalities that were either using those provisions or planning on using those provisions are the ones that are going to be most likely looking at this new CBC charge. And one of the other restrictions introduced by the final changes to the legislation is that CBCs can only be applied to what I'll refer to as high density developments, and I'll define that in a few moments. So on this slide, I'm just summarizing the three main tools for municipalities for funding development related infrastructure. As I indicated, the Development Charges Act will continue to be your prime tool. And there were some important changes. One of them was the removal of the 10% discount on general services. And now there's a very prescriptive list of eligible services under the Development Charges Act. And there are a few things that some of you were funding through development charges that will no longer be eligible for development charge funding and will need to shift to the community benefits charge. But I'll get into some specifics in a moment. Under the Planning Act, you're going to have two provisions. One is the Parkland acquisition and dedication provisions. Fortunately, those have remained largely unchanged. We were looking at some significant changes to the alternative rate, and that's been removed. So that's going to continue to be your prime tool for acquiring parkland or cash in lieu. And then we have this new community benefits charge, which once again is funding for development-related infrastructure. It's going to fund that initial round of capital costs, just like the development charges. And it's going to be capped at 4% of the land value of any specific development coming forward. And once again, it has to be for high density development, which the legislation defines as a building that is 5 or more stories and has 10 or more residential units. And I'll discuss that a little bit more in a few more slides. But generally, I think we should be pleased with the state of the legislation as it exists today, as it gives us a broad base to fund what I would argue a greater share of the development related costs. So let's focus in on the CBCs for the next few minutes. Just some basics on the legislative framework. It is under Section 37 of the Planning Act, the same section that currently has the density bonusing provisions. We have a 2-year transition period, which I'll talk to at the back end of the presentation. And so eventually the density bonusing provisions will be gone and we'll be left with the CBC provisions. Unfortunately, one of the things introduced is that the CBCs are restricted to use by lower tier municipalities and single tier municipalities. So regional or upper tier governments will not be getting into the CBC regime. It's probably okay because those upper tiers were not using Section 37 and don't have any parkland needs. And most of the things that they were funding through development charges remain under that act. So it's not such a bad outcome. And once again, this restriction on high density development. So just to be clear, it has to be a building with 5 stories or more and has to have 10 or more residential units. So that does mean that it's not just restricted to high density residential, it could be a multi-use building. So if you had a building that had a ground floor retail and maybe even second floor with some medical offices and then had say 4 or 5 stories of residential units above it, as long as there's more than 10 residential units, 10 or more, then that entire parcel of land could be subject to the community benefits charge. And then, as I indicated, under the regulations, the charge levied under the CBC regime cannot be more than 4% of the site value of any specific development. It's going to make the establishing the charges a little bit trickier, but that's the key sort of ceiling to the tools. And then also there's a requirement under the legislation that if you're going to implement a CBC bylaw, you're required to have a strategy with a list of projects. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a few slides. So what can CBCs fund? It's a nice tool in that it is very broad in the things that it can fund. There's a few restrictions similar to the restrictions under the Development Charges Act, like central administration functions, but generally it can fund a broad range of services and projects and can even overlap with services that are fundable under the Development Charges Act and under Section 42 planning, dedication, and cash in lieu provisions. Of course, we can't fund the same share of a project cost from DCs and CBCs or parkland contributions, but we can fund the same project as long as we're funding different shares. It may make it somewhat complex, but it's going to allow the use of CBCs to pick up any funding restrictions under the Development Charges Act and to reflect the increased needs arising from that high density development. So it's going to be important as municipalities move forward, if they're going to consider the CBCs, that they do that in collaboration, or at least within consideration of their prevailing development charges and their parkland dedication. But collectively, these three tools are going to allow us to fund a good share of development-related infrastructure needs. So one of the key questions I've been getting from municipalities since the passage of the legislation is, well, what is the CBC strategy going to look like? So once again, it's a requirement under the legislation, but there's very little guidance about what needs to be in the strategy itself. There are some things that must be there. For example, we need to have a forecast of development and redevelopment for the lands to which the community benefits will be imposed. So I think it's going to look very much like your development charges background study development forecast, except it's going to have to highlight out those buildings that meet that criteria of being 5 or more stories and having 10 or more residential units. And then we're going to have to estimate the increased need arising from that development for the services and functions that we're looking to recover for. We then need to identify the facilities, services, and matters that will be funded from the community benefits charge. And just like under the Development Charges Act, when we look at those, we're going to have to identify if there's a benefit to existing share, if there's going to be capacity within those facilities to meet growth beyond our planning horizons, and then other adjustments for things like grants, subsidies, and indeed, if you're going to be funding a share of the program from development charges or parkland dedication, we need to reflect that in the list of projects. So the second section here just says CBC capital program. And my current thought is that it's going to look very similar to the kind of project list we have in development charge background studies. The fortunate thing is that we're not as prescriptive, so we don't have to deal with 10-year historic service levels and other factors, but the project list should include a description of the project, anticipated timing, the gross cost of undertaking the project, and identifying the other funding sources, and then finally, what portion of that project are you looking to fund from the CBC regime. Interestingly, we've been giving some thought to what might the rate structure look like under the CBC regime. The legislation actually doesn't prescribe how the rates must be structured. It does, the legislation clearly says that the amount of the community benefits charge payable in any particular case cannot exceed the amount of the prescribed percentage, which I indicated was 4%. So once again, that's on any particular case, it can't. And it's going to be very hard to sort of structure the rate around that. But that doesn't mean that the CBC, at least in my opinion, needs to be set as a percentage of land value, because that's not what's set out in the legislation. We could continue to have a CBC that looks like a development charge. It could be on a per unit basis, like a per apartment basis. I think it could even be give consideration to doing it on a per square foot basis, like a gross floor area of either the entire building or of a particular unit. Or it could even be a land area based charge on a per hectare, $1 per hectare, or it could be a percentage of land value. I think there's a significant amount of flexibility. And as we move through the first round of studies, I think we're going to determine what structure works best, and it could vary from one municipality to the next. I also think that the legislation is generally flexible enough to allow us to do area rating. You may only want to have CBC charges in one portion of your municipality, or you may want to have higher rates in some portions and lower rates in others, as long as you're not offending the 4% cap. We also may have bands of charges by the type of building, the size of building, and maybe you want to max out the charge at a certain building height. Say, in Toronto context, we get some very large buildings, so you may cap it at a certain amount. Or even in some smaller municipalities, you may want to encourage smaller buildings or certain types. And so there's ways of structuring the charge to help encourage or incent certain types of built form while still using the charge to recover costs associated with the increased needs arising from this higher density built form. What about the implementation process? It's actually very similar to the development charge process, but once again, we have less prescription around what that process needs to look like. The legislation says that we need to have consultation, but that's really not defined. There isn't a prescribed public meeting or anything alike, but I think we will probably give that. There is the requirement to pass a bylaw and give notice of that bylaw. And one of the interesting things as well is that you're only allowed to have one CBC bylaw in force at any given time. That's unlike the Development Charges Act, where we can have multiple bylaws and even overlapping bylaws. But as I indicated earlier, I still think within a single CBC bylaw, we can do some area rating and do some structuring of the charges to reflect different needs in different communities within a municipality, or perhaps even just reflect different desires of the municipality. It's also important to note that the CBC bylaws are appealable to LPAT, the former OMB tribunal, and so they have to be defensible and they have to be reasonable. There also is the requirement to establish a CBC reserve account, which in the language of the legislation is referred to as a special account. The annual reporting is also required for that special account. Like the Development Charges Act, you're going to need to show an opening balance, a closing balance, identify the transactions relating to the account. There's also a provision that says in each calendar year, a municipality shall spend or allocate at least 60% of the monies that are in the special account at the beginning of the year. So I want to stress with that last point. Fortunately, the language says spend or allocate. If it had just said spend, that might have created challenges for municipalities because some of these expenditures are very large and you want to be able to accumulate the money over a period of years. So I think through this process, what we're going to have to do is each year allocate a share to a project that's going to occur in the future and isolate out that within the special account or the reserve fund. I think there will be opportunities to readjust that each year, or at least every time you update your CBC bylaw and policy. I mentioned that there's a transition period. Basically, the legislation says that if you're going to utilize these tools and the changes to the Development Charges Act, those services that are no longer eligible, that all has to be done by the latest of September of 2022. If there's also the provision, if you implement a CBC bylaw before that date, then the other provisions of the Development Charges Act effectively kick into place. And so that, for example, if you currently have parking within your development charge background study and bylaw, that's a service that's no longer eligible. So you may want to fund that through CBCs. But even if you decide not to implement a CBC bylaw, your parking development charge will expire in September of 2022. As I think all of you are probably aware, the Ontario municipal elections are to be held on October 24th of 2022. Many municipalities don't want to deal with things like development charges too close to municipal elections. And so we're seeing many municipalities looking to undertake development charge updates and initiate CBC studies during this year, 2021, with the objective of having new bylaws passed late in 2021 or in the first quarter of 2022. We are also seeing and anticipating some benefits in undertaking all three studies concurrently. That's development charges, the Parkland, if you're proposing to use the alternative rate, and the CBCs. Or if you're just looking at introducing the CBCs, there may be some benefits and efficiencies to looking at your development charges at the same time. I would also stress, however, that there's going to be some municipalities that decide not to proceed earlier. If you're not planning to use the CBC or introduce it right away, if you're not proposing to use the Parkland alternative rate, and you're not anxious to increase your development charges to reflect the removal of the 10% discount, you may just want to stay pat and allow your development charge bylaw to run its course and update it when it expires. And certainly you're allowed to do that under the current legislation framework. Just to touch on some key takeaways from my perspective. Once again, I don't think all municipalities are going to implement a CBC. However, it's clear that most urban GTA municipalities and larger single-tier municipalities will look to implement a CBC and likely do it sometime this year. Primarily driving that is that they need a replacement for the lost Section 37 bonusing money, as many municipalities were utilizing that tool or planning on implementing it this year or next. And so they're going to need some avenue to fund that share of development-related costs. In talking with other municipalities outside the GTA, some are saying, well, let's just wait and see. We are not anticipating significant amounts of the high-density development that will qualify for a CBC, or alternatively, they may be trying to attract that type of built form to their community. So they just want to hold off and see how things progress. I think some of them are also saying, why don't we let some of the GTA municipalities work through the first round of CBC charges and bylaws and see how that process goes. And also there's likely to be some challenges. As I indicated, I think there are some efficiencies and benefits to undertaking a CBC study concurrently with a DC study. So if you're looking at either updating your development charge study or undertaking a CBC study, I think you should at least give consideration to doing them concurrently. It maximizes funding opportunities while ensuring that there's no double counting, because there could be projects that you want to fund from both tools or shares of it. I think you can also combine the public process because it's the same stakeholders, so you're not duplicating a process. And it allows for you to carry that forward to council in the same public process as well and have the bylaws moving together concurrently. You also might want to consider reviewing your parkland acquisition policies, but for many of you, you'll probably just stay the course with those, but it's worth looking at them in the context of the changes of the legislation and the introduction of a CBC bylaw and charges. So that's the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your time.